It's become a pattern. Each time Israel steps up its bombing campaign against Gaza, it spreads a new talking point about Hamas brutality to justify or distract from its actions. Early in the war, these claims concerned the killing of civilians by Hamas, which certainly did happen, but they also included claims about the sadistic and ritualistic murder of babies, which didn't happen. The latter claims were used to say Hamas is the same as ISIS, but those weren't true. One baby in total was killed on October the 7th, which is bad enough, of course, but contrary to a claim repeated by the literal president of the United States, the baby was not beheaded. Israel is once again now stepping up its bombing campaign against Gaza, and now a new set of allegations are gaining prominence. They involve allegations of sexual assault. And once again, it's become difficult to separate claims which are well evidenced and likely to be true and those that aren't. Let's start by talking you through some of the most prominent claims. On the front page of the Sunday Times this weekend was this story: "I saw Hamas rape women before killing them," says massacre survivor. That article included very gruesome testimony, and I should warn you, it's graphic and distressing. Speaking to the Sunday Times is a 39-year-old man named Yoni Sadon, a survivor from the Nova Music Festival. So he said this: "I saw this beautiful woman with the face of an angel and 8 or 10 of the fighters beating and raping her. She was screaming, 'Stop it, already, I'm going to die anyway from what you were doing, just kill me.' When they finished, they were laughing, and the last one shot her in the head." He then says, "The horror did not end there. Hiding in the bushes, he saw 2 more Hamas fighters. They had caught a young woman near a car, and she was fighting back, not allowing them to strip her. They threw her to the ground, and one of the terrorists took a shovel and beheaded her, and her head rolled along the ground. I see that head too." Now that's, incredibly graphic testimony. All right, it's sort of along the lines of sort of the sadistic things we were hearing about when it came to how they sort of acted in the kibbutzes. How should we think about this? We will go on to discuss that. It followed a widely shared article by Haaretz English late last week, which said this: "The scope of Hamas's campaign of rape against Israeli women is revealed testimony after testimony." And then this important point: "The aggregation of evidence collected by Dr. Kuchav El-Kayam Levy and her civil commission presents a horrifying picture that leaves no room for doubt. On October the 7th, Hamas terrorists systematically carried out acts of rape and sexual abuse." So they use this phrase, leaves no room for doubt, and then says systematically carried out acts of rape and sexual abuse. So a very specific claim. And we'll look a bit more into that Haaretz piece in a moment. First, though, let's take a look at some of the politics around all of this, because these stories, have coincided with protests against organizations who are accused of not taking these alleged crimes seriously enough. And the United Nations in particular has been in the firing line.
U.S. Senator Kirsten Gillibrand, one of many voices speaking at a special session at the UN called "Hear Our Voices: Sexual and Gender-Based Violence in the October 7th Hamas Terror Attack."
The United Nations must denounce Hamas as a terrorist organization that uses rape as a weapon of war.
Before the session, hundreds rallied across from the UN. Yarash Shiran's 24-year-old cousin, Danielle Waldman, was murdered at the Nova Music Festival.
It's been nearly 2 months. There's not been a word. And we've decided that it's time to show support for women that have been killed. They cannot speak for themselves.
The rally comes after late last week, the UN Secretary General and the organization UN Women released statements on the matter. Last Wednesday, the UN Secretary General posted the abhorrent attacks of terror by Hamas must be vigorously investigated and prosecuted. Then late Friday night, UN Women said in part, "We unequivocally condemn the brutal attacks by Hamas. We are alarmed by the numerous accounts of gender-based atrocities. This is why we have called for all accounts to be duly investigated and prosecuted."
After 8 weeks, the UN Women put one paragraph in a whole message in the middle, remarking, just saying that there was such a thing and acknowledging it, but it's way too little and too late, and we expect much more.
So that's sort of a campaign against the civil society, or a campaign against the UN, by civil society groups who are concerned that they haven't taken this seriously enough or haven't commented specifically or explicitly enough. And politicians have also got involved. Hillary Clinton released this video on Monday.
"As you well know, many women and girls were attacked brutally by Hamas on October 7th, and they have testified to the gender-based violence that they both experienced and witnessed. As a global community, we must respond to weaponized sexual violence wherever it happens with absolute condemnation.
Clinton went on to say, quote, "It is outrageous that some who claim to stand for justice are closing their eyes and their hearts to the victims of Hamas." So sort of taking a similar attack line at people who aren't saying the same thing as her, essentially. Benjamin Netanyahu has taken a similar line.
You've also heard about sexual abuse and some vicious rapes. But I must say that until just a few days ago, I haven't heard anything from human rights organizations. I didn't hear women's organizations. I didn't hear anything from women organizations in the UN. I did not hear their outcry. So I say to them, where are you? Did you remain silent because these are Jewish women? I would like to say this in a language that everybody understands.
Organizations, to the human rights organizations, you've heard of the rape of Israeli women? Horrible atrocities, sexual mutilation? Where the hell are you? I expect all civilized leaders, governments, nations to speak up against this atrocity.
So what is actually going on here? Well, it seems obvious this argument is being coordinated to justify the indiscriminate bombing of Gazans who had nothing to do with the October the 7th attack. So that's, of course, appalling in and of itself. But that doesn't mean the claims themselves aren't true. And as I said earlier, the testimony I read out at the start of this segment describes acts which are beyond appalling. But I have also found some of the most viral reporting on this story unconvincing. The Haaretz article I showed you earlier was shared by a number of famous journalists like Jake Tapper from CNN. And Tapper repeated the headline claim that Hamas campaign of rape against Israeli women has been revealed testimony after testimony. Now, I read that article, it's quite long, and it's quite strange for this reason. It doesn't actually contain any testimony. Instead, it was a profile of a lawyer, Dr. Kochav El-Kayem Levy, who has set up a commission into sexual violence by Hamas. Now, El-Kayem Levy is currently an academic, but previously has had a posting working for the Israeli Attorney General's office. Now, of that commission, Haaretz write this: they are assembling one account after another, one piece of evidence after another, and gradually putting together all the pieces of the puzzle. The aggregation of the evidence presents a horrifying picture that leaves no room for doubt. Under cover of the massacre, Hamas carried out a campaign of rape and sexual abuse at many of the communities adjacent to the Gaza Strip that it attacked. So this was odd to me because the widely shared headline suggested Haaretz had heard this testimony themselves and that it left no room for doubt. But instead they are reporting on the testimony someone else says they have heard. And in fact, later on in the article, El-Kayem Levy says that her commission hasn't directly heard any testimony. So they are instead collecting testimony collected by other people, which makes this third-hand evidence, right? So not necessarily the stronger evidence. What's also odd in the article is El-Kayem Levy's attitude to evidence itself. So she calls the group UN Women anti-Semitic for accusing Israel of genocide while ignoring allegations of mass rape, and then says this: when a woman is raped, the discourse immediately revolves around evidentiary questions. Is there or is there not evidence of rape? Doubt is cast on the woman, her reliability is questioned, and a question mark is posed as to whether it did or did not happen. This casting of doubt is now directed against us at the collective level. She goes on. Questions are asked like, is there or isn't there semen? Was there or wasn't there a rape kit? Those same female jurists with international reputations who are conducting this discussion apparently do not have a basic understanding of international law. International law does not talk the language of the individual case. My call to them is to look beyond those denial mechanisms. You are facing a bunch of respected women and telling them that shocking crimes were committed here. Am I the one who needs to provide the evidence for the terrorist deeds? What kind of travesty is it that they are imposing the burden of proof on me? She's running this commission. The article is based on her claims, but then she seems kind of annoyed that other people want to see evidence. Now, as I said, obviously evidence shouldn't be available to everyone, but to the specific groups who they are asking to sort of condemn things, seems reasonable for some to be provided. And I have to say, I feel especially sorry for the UN in all of this. They've been constantly accused of being blind to the reality of what happened on October the 7th. They've been called anti-Semitic. They've been told they don't care about Jewish women because they're Jewish. But to me, it seems more like they want a chance to assess what actually happened. Now, this is from a BBC report earlier in the week. An ongoing UN Commission of Inquiry investigating alleged war crimes on both sides of the Israel-Hamas conflict will include a focus on sexual violence carried out during the attacks on the 7th of October. However, Israel has so far not cooperated with the commission, viewing it as biased. Navi Pillay, who chairs the inquiry, said if Tel Aviv did not want to cooperate, her team could still take evidence from survivors and witnesses outside the country. All they have to do is let us in, talking about Israel, she told the BBC, adding that survivors of the attack should be able to get a UN hearing. Ms. Pillay also rejected claims that the UN delayed acknowledging that sexual violence had taken place during Hamas's attacks and said every effort was being made as part of her team's investigations. So to me, it seems very unfair to demand an international body condemn an atrocity. Why haven't you condemned this before giving them any chance at all to independently assess that it happened, right? They're saying we want to be let in, we want to have some access, we want to be part of this investigatory process if you want us to make these big statements and these big condemnations. And Israel is saying, well, because you didn't make the statement, you are therefore biased, and therefore we're not going to let you be involved in the investigation. So there's a bit of a circular logic there, which seems to be putting them in a very difficult position. This round of accusations has also had another familiar element when it comes to this war. Video and photographic evidence of rape, in this case, is constantly alluded to, but it is rarely seen or verified by journalists themselves. Again, I'm not saying this should be made public. I'm not saying anyone should be sending this, the Israelis should be sending this to Novara media, but you could send it to Reuters, you could send it to Associated Press. Last night, the BBC, probably one of the most high-profile news programs in this country, at 10, so the BBC News at 10 led with this report. It contains very graphic testimony you might find distressing.
Out of the chaos and mass trauma of the Hamas attacks, new stories are starting to emerge of rape and sexual assault, including graphic testimony from an eyewitness interviewed by police.
They bent her over, and I realized they were raping her, one by one. Then she was passed to another man in uniform. She was still alive when she was being raped. He shot her in the head while he was still raping her. He didn't even lift his pants. They cut off her breast and played with it on the street.
The scale of sexual violence here isn't clear. Bodies were mutilated and survivors few. And police admit they're facing a lack of forensic evidence from the site. You can still hear the Israeli bombardment of Gaza and see vast clouds of black smoke hanging over the Gaza Strip. But in the days following the attack, this site was an active combat zone. It was a big enough challenge to collect the bodies, let alone early forensic evidence of sexual crimes. Videos shot by Hamas during the attacks, an early warning. A large blood stain on the trousers of one woman captive. Female bodies piled on trucks, naked or semi-clothed. Body collectors describe piles of women's bodies, naked from the waist down, some photographed with their legs splayed, often mutilated or burnt.
You see the way that it's burnt.
And those who witnessed sexual attacks have struggled with what they saw.
I spoke with girls that are now, at least 3 girls, that are now hospitalized for a very hard psychiatric situation because of the rapes they watched. They pretended to be dead and they watched it and they heard everything from the side. Some of them want to kill themselves, some can't deal with it.
Now, the testimony at the start, that was incredibly distressing. The implication of the blurred images to me is somewhat less clear, but I do think there was some pretty key context the BBC missed out in that last section of the clip we showed you. So the on-screen label pointed out that May Golan worked for the Israeli government, but she was spoken to pretty much like a neutral expert. And she most certainly isn't. So just 7 months ago, Netanyahu caused controversy when he nominated May Golan to be Israel's top diplomat in Israel. It was controversial because she is a self-proclaimed racist. So that Guardian article, of which we just showed you the headline, it says this: Golan made a political name for herself by denouncing African refugees in Israel, calling them Muslim infiltrators, criminals, and rapists. She said many have AIDS, suggesting they were spreading HIV by working as waiters, and demanded they be expelled from the country. If I am a racist for wanting to defend my country and for wanting to protect my basic rights and security, then I'm a proud racist, she said at a political rally in 2013 as a member of the far-right Jewish Power Party, a descendant of the Kark party that was outlawed under Israeli anti-terrorism laws. Golan's appointment was ultimately deemed too controversial, so instead of a diplomatic job, she was made a minister for women's equality or women's empowerment. I found that interesting that there was no political background given there, even though whenever now the BBC says the death toll in Gaza, they have to say the Hamas-run health ministry to sort of say this is political information, which might not be completely true. Then they've got this far-right Israeli minister who's talked to like she's just a neutral expert. I found that somewhat problematic. As you can probably tell, I don't know what to think about this topic in general. I don't want to make any particularly strong claims. I don't think I have enough expertise in this. What's clear is that the allegations being made are appalling, but that some of the reporting around this topic doesn't seem to be of the highest quality. So it's all incredibly sensitive. And earlier today, I spoke to someone who I hoped would help me make sense of it. Heidi Matthews is Assistant Professor of Law at York University in Canada and specialises in international law, political violence and gender. I began by asking her how she assesses the claims about systematic sex crimes committed by Hamas.
The general public doesn't actually really have access to any accounts or direct evidence ourselves, right? And I think that's one of the things that folks are finding a little bit frustrating about some of the claims being made in the media right now. What we do have, though, is a set of information given to us by what's called a civil commission that's been organized by a number of academics and researchers working in the Israeli context, who are working to sort of collate and document for the purpose of creating a public database various kinds of evidence. That evidence, according to the commissioners, involves testimonies, involves evidence being turned over or revealed to them by Israeli police investigative units, also by first responders, news reports, video and audio clips. So it's quite a wide range of evidence. And beyond what the public has sort of been repeatedly invited to view in terms of video evidence, we don't really have access to the full record. I mean, that's not like strange in and of itself. So I will say this, the bottom line is essentially that there's a bunch of evidence being put together by a civil commission in Israel that is distinct from work that's being done by, for example, the Independent International Commission of Inquiry on the occupied Palestinian territory, including East Jerusalem and Israel. And so on the one hand, we have sort of an Israeli outfit, a non-governmental outfit, yet an Israeli outfit sort of undertaking this work. And on the other hand, we have an independent international commission that's been set up and mandated by the UN to do this work, but has not received the sort of cooperation from Israel that would actually be necessary to carry out fulsome independent investigation. The only other thing I would say right there is that I have no doubt personally that acts of sexual violence were indeed committed by Hamas militants and perhaps militants of other groups as well. I think that basic fact is not something that should be obscured in this discussion. But there are important other discussions to be had around who's doing the investigating, when the information comes out, and the purposes to which that information is then put politically in other ways.
So one of the things I've found, I suppose, a bit confusing in this conflict, and I imagine you've followed stories such as this more than I have, is the extent to which the evidence we're often told about evidence, let's say, and I'm not really expecting, us at Novara Media to get sent direct evidence or for viewers at home to be shown this evidence. But you often have this construction where a journalist is talking to someone who is telling them about evidence that they've seen or testimonies that they've been told about. And it seems that we're often getting into sort of second-hand or third-hand accounts. And there are some first-hand accounts. We have to be absolutely clear about that. In the Sunday Times, they had a gentleman who was a survivor at the Nova Festival who was describing some what sound like completely atrocious moments. At the same time, in this conflict up to now, there have been first-hand accounts that have turned out to be wrong. So many of the sort of most salacious headlines when it came to sort of the ritualistic murder of babies came from first responders, right? And I don't want to say anyone is making stuff up, right? But it does seem that relying on the testimony of people who have just come out of an incredibly traumatic event, or relying on the testimony of, say, one person, does seem a little bit risky journalistically.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's right. And one of the first examples of this with respect to the discrete question of sexual violence, I think, is with Joe Biden himself, right? Who way back on October 10th talked about the rape and mutilation of women on October 7th, which, I think was some days before the IDF itself um, came out and confirmed that sexual violence had in fact taken place, right? And so there's been quite a bit of slippage in terms of what folks are willing to say, like politically, and then I think that easily slips into the journalistic sphere as well, right? I've done a lot of work and research in my career around the way in which we've shifted our attitudes to sexual violence claims in the wake of the so-called Me Too movement. And something that I've been critical of, so for 5 or 6 years now, is the way in which this sort of this mantra of believe women has really come to sort of occupy center stage and make it really difficult for those of us who are interested in well done, truthful, accurate, non propagandist reports around gender-based and sexual violence to get a handle on what's going on. And so what we see right now is that any attempt journalistically to even ask for clarification around a certain piece of evidence, or maybe ask for corroboration or anything that would kind of enhance the reliability or the credibility of that piece of information, is then very quickly met with the response that, well, that's anti-Semitic. There's a hashtag that's going around that says, Me Too, unless you're a Jew, I believe. So really kind of crass ways that pull on some of the attitudes that we've, moved into with the Me Too movement over the last years.
Another thing I'm not that sure about, and I know lots of people have sort of had questions about, is what evidence it is normal to have in a situation such as this. So, the fact that there are no survivors giving testimony, there is an obvious explanation for that, a grim explanation, which is that people who suffered sexual violence were killed, in the allegations which are being made. I'm not in a position to say either way. There are other sort of gaps in the evidence which seem like they do require a bit more explanation. So, as far as I understand, Israel didn't take any forensic evidence from bodies of sexual violence. And they're saying that's because, they were completely overwhelmed by the numbers. Everyone working here was volunteers. Is that usual? Is that sort of an understandable and persuasive sort of explanation as to why that forensic evidence doesn't exist?
Yeah, so with the caveat that kind of forensics are not my personal area of expertise, I will say that within the realm of international criminal law prosecution and adjudication, and which I'm very familiar with, there are lots of times where crimes are being prosecuted years and years and years after the fact, and where the kinds of evidence that we might want to traditionally receive in a domestic context. So if you're thinking about physical evidence along the lines of a rape kit, for example, that kind of a thing is not going to be available simply based on the passage of time on the one hand, but also based on the resources available. So if you look at, for example, the International Criminal Court, so many of the prosecutions there are taking place on the African continent with respect to situations in the African continent where there just aren't necessarily the kind of resources necessary to conduct that kind of forensic investigation. Now, for Israelis themselves, I think in particular, they might want to have very different sort of standards with respect to the level of investigation that their own government is going to conduct regarding crimes committed on Israeli soil. And I think part of what's really interesting when we might perceive some deficits in terms of Israeli police and military investigation on the ground is that those deficits are taking place in the context of Israeli refusal to participate with internationally mandated procedures, right, including the International Commission I've already mentioned, and also the International Criminal Court and its prosecutor as well. So essentially, we have a situation where Israel is saying, we're going to go this alone. We're going to determine the evidence and what should be done with it. We're going to determine what constitutes a crime, what doesn't, and what's going to be done about it. And we actually don't want the input of the international community. And the sort of really fascinating double speak that's happening there is that Israel is doing that at the same time that it's crying out for international attention, crying out for UN Women and CEDAW and other international organizations dedicated to the advancement of women and girls to say more and do more around the question of sexual violence on October 7th. And yet the government is unwilling to adequately cooperate with the UN and is also calling the UN sort of defunct and ineffective on the other hand. So there's this really interesting double speak happening there.
I know you sort of work on two related issues, which lots of people sort of see as in conflict. And I've seen you've got into a lot of trouble with lots of very famous Americans over the past 24 hours about this. But you both sort of study and take very seriously rape used as a weapon of war and sexual violence in conflict. And you take very seriously how allegations of sexual violence are used to justify atrocities. So sexual violence as part of atrocities and how sexual violence is used to justify atrocities. Obviously, that's, an intersection which is very sensitive to talk about. How have you sort of kept those two thoughts in your head when it comes to what's happening in this current Israel-Gaza, Israel-Palestine, Gaza war, this current conflict?
For me, it's a natural impulse to take what I call sort of methodologically critical legal studies and sort of apply that to what we're looking at in the world, right? And what that, it's not. I'm not trying to be jargonistic here. I'm just trying to say that it's really important to both kind of acknowledge like the physical reality of what's in front of us and be very, very attentive at the same time, always at the same time, in fact, to the way in which those realities of oppression, of atrocity, of authoritarianism, abuse, etc., all of the narratives we tell, especially around legal accountability, for example, about those events are always already embedded in power structures, right? And so, who gets to tell the story, the frame in which the story is told, and then the ask that's made of the public, and including the public coffers, is always done by those, holding the power, as it were. And so, really, what I try to do is to look at both of those things at the same time, and to ask, when we talk about defending humanity or standing up for human rights or doing what's good in the world, we all want to do that. At least I increasingly question that, but I still hold like a glimmer of hope that we're all, essentially dedicated to living the best lives we can and then ensuring that for as many people on the planet as well. But to be able to do that, we need to be attentive to the distribution of power and all too often legal categories, especially and including around violations of the law of war, for example, international humanitarian law. Those arguments and allegations are made with a view to achieving a different kind of outcome than just kind of justice simpliciter, right? The outcome that's sought to be achieved is gaining greater power.